So,
Fine.
hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Fionnuala. I'm a nurse with the Irish Cancer Society, and I'm just moderating this session by Dr. Algeo, or Naomi. She's a senior occupational therapist in St. James's Hospital. She also sits on the World Health Organization Development Group for Cancer Rehabilitation, and her PhD supported or focused on supporting return to work for those living with and beyond cancer. And I suppose we all know that, when you're going through cancer treatment, our focus can be very much on getting life back to normal afterwards, getting back to work. And I suppose hopefully Naomi will be able to give us some strategies to manage cancer-related treatment side effects and the other bits and pieces that can affect us getting back to work, and about navigating the whole process. So I'd just like to welcome Dr. Algeo, and if you can put some questions in the chat box on the right-hand side, and then I can ask her at the end of the session. I'll also put in the number for our cancer support line. So if, when the talk is all over and later on in the day, you have a couple of questions, you can ring our support line on Monday, and the girls might be able to direct you or answer some of the questions for you. Okay, so I'll leave you to it now.
Super, thanks, Fionnuala. You can see my screen okay? I hope. Super, thanks everybody for having me today. It's great that we have the option of online and face-to-face. Today I'll be presenting on navigating a return to work after cancer. So I could speak about this for weeks on end, but I will try and put in some key points, I suppose, in the next 30 minutes or so. And of course, we'll take some questions after. So very briefly, we're going to touch on a whistle-stop tour of cancer and employment in Ireland in general. We'll be looking at one of the ESRI and Irish Cancer Society reports and some main things to take out of that. Looking briefly at some employment rights entitlements, managing cancer-related fatigue at work, and we'll also touch on phased return to work, which feeds into that. Managing cognitive symptoms at work, ergonomics, so how we organise our workplace, and that's where I change my sitting position usually as a reminder, and looking at assessing readiness to return to work. How do we know when we're actually ready, or will we ever feel ready to return? So having a quick look at cancer and work in Ireland. So as I mentioned, this was a report that was published in February of last year, and it was commissioned by the Irish Cancer Society and led by the ESRI, and it was a nationwide survey of hundreds of people living with and beyond cancer. And I just wanted to take some key facts from it, which I think is interesting. So first of all, set the scene, the average length of time taken off work in Ireland following a cancer diagnosis is 40 weeks. But what's really interesting is if you look at the range, some people weren't able or didn't take off any time off work at all. And some others were up to 240 weeks. So we're looking at near the 5-year mark. So if that tells us anything, it's that everyone is so different, and it can depend on so many factors, including the type of cancer, the type of treatment. And very often people, will come to me and they might talk about comparing themselves to other people that they might have known with a cancer diagnosis. But I suppose that everyone's situation is so different. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. When they looked at motivation, so why do people return to work? I suppose it's no surprise that for most people, or 38% of people said it was for financial reasons. Other people talked about wanting the sense of normality, whatever normality is. Others found their work meaningful, and 3% felt pressure from their employer. So I suppose, we never want to have any pressure from employers, but I suppose it's promising to know that the majority didn't feel pressure. This is also really interesting. So what can help a return to work? So these are people who've gone through the process. So what helped them? And we can see at the bottom here, these are the biggest things that helped. And you can see number one, that phased return to work. Nearly 45% of people said that really helped them. You also see the help and support from colleagues and employers. time off for medical appointments. So negotiating with your employer about that, and flexibility. So there's some examples of what can help a return. And I suppose on the flip side, we'll also look at what might hinder or challenge a return to work. And what we can see here very clearly is that both physical and psychological health issues were the main things that people found challenging, I suppose unsurprisingly, when they returned to work. But what is promising is that very often these type of side effects are amenable to change. So we know that we can work on them to help either manage them better, or hopefully over time reduce or completely negate them. So looking at employment rights and entitlements, I am going to signpost that there is a full session dedicated on not necessarily just employment, but benefits and entitlements in general. I think that's in the session after lunch. So keep an eye on the timetable for that. I will be talking about one or two things that I would very often support some of my outpatients in St. James's Hospital in applying for. Before we go anywhere, let's look at the law. And technically, a disability is a substantial restriction in the capacity of somebody to carry on a profession, business, or occupation, or to participate in social and cultural life in the Irish state. And that's by reason of an enduring physical, sensory, mental health, or intellectual impairment. And technically, even if somebody's cancer is completely gone, anyone living with or beyond cancer can be considered to have a disability under Irish law, even if they no longer experience any type of restriction. And that, in a way, is a good thing in that it gives you more protective rights, which we'll discuss now in a moment, including reusable accommodations. So everybody has the right to reasonable accommodations. And a reasonable accommodation is a change or modification. So they might, might change or adapt tasks or how your job is structured in order to enable you or an employee with a disability, and that's where we bring in that law piece, to complete the job and to enjoy equal opportunities. So I suppose we have a caveat in that under EU law, it has to be, reasonable. So, for example, I am an occupational therapist in St. James's Hospital. It would be unreasonable of me to work maybe 5 days a week from home, because typically my job role is patient facing. I'm on the wards. So it depends really very much on your job role. And sometimes there's a nice balance that can be struck. So I'll just give you some examples of reasonable accommodations. It might be a phased return to work, which we're going to discuss in a little bit. It could be your flexibility in your working hours, perhaps working from home, change in your job description, technology or adaptations to support any impairment, or maybe changes to your environment. So for example, having suitable seating if you're at a desk-based role, or maybe that you need a height adjustable table, something like that. So that would be seen as a reasonable accommodation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because thank you to Fionnuala for the introduction at the beginning. And I was talking about our research that we completed in Trinity, and we're still completing more phases to it. But it was really interesting. We were looking at women with breast cancer, and we were asking about their perceptions or thoughts on reasonable accommodations. And it was just interesting in that both women with breast cancer and employers actually felt that when they thought of reasonable accommodations, they would often think of, visually what they would see, that they could visually see a physical impairment or something like that. Very often they wouldn't associate it with things that are invisible, like maybe pain or fatigue or cognitive brain fog, anything like that. So that's something just to hammer home, that a reasonable accommodation is there to support any impairment, whether it's visible or invisible. Very often I would write letters of support to employers for some of my outpatients with a list of recommended reasonable accommodations for their job role. This is a grant that's available. So it's the Workplace Equipment and Adaptation Grant, the WEAG. And this is for people in the private sector or who are self-employed. So we're talking about reasonable accommodations, and maybe, for example, we might look at the ergonomics. We might look at a well-suited chair and a desk. And a lot of people will say to me, well, I can't ask my employer for that. It's a lot of money. And this is where maybe, particularly in those smaller companies, private sector companies, or if somebody is self-employed, there's a grant. So you can apply for a grant. I think it's up to €6,350. And depending on what you're asking for, you need to either have 1, 2, or 3 quotes for the pieces of equipment. So that is one thing to look into. Again, you can look it up on Citizens Information. What about if I work in the public sector? Technically, your employer should be able to make this type of equipment or resources available within that sector. So this is specifically for people who work either in the private sector or who are self-employed. The partial capacity benefit. If you are watching this on catch up, or this is being recorded, so if you are going to watch this in the future, please note that the eligibility criteria for this benefit changes rapidly. I am constantly updating my slides and my presentations. As of today, or as of rather 2 days ago, when I was, I suppose, finalizing these slides, the partial capacity benefit is a social welfare scheme. And it is there to encourage people to return to work if they have a reduced capacity to work. So, for example, if maybe fatigue is a big issue, or you're experiencing a lot of brain fog, whatever it might be, physical, cognitive, or psychological. So, the criteria as it stands is you need to have been claiming illness benefit for at least 6 months, or the invalidity pension. You also need to have your restriction on your capacity to work assessed. So you need to ring them up. You need to ask them to send you out this purple form here, which they'll post to you. Typically, it is it's not available online. There's a sample version online, but you need to request it by post. And you fill out a self-assessment piece, and then your GP will typically fill out another part of that form. And essentially, it'll ask you on how does your condition or any side effects that you experience, how does that impact on your day-to-day? So they'll be talking about self-care, leisure, productivity, things like that. Very often, I will write letters of support to support people in this application as part of supplementary information, but they'll assess you as either mild, moderate, severe, or profound. Mild doesn't qualify. So you need to be at least moderate or above. And most people would say to me, Naomi, I only have fatigue, so I'm not going to get this. I've never had somebody with fatigue not get this with the right support in getting the benefit. So please don't let any of the invisible, I suppose, side effects impact your motivation to apply for this. Really, I suppose what I love about this benefit is that a lot of people will feel under pressure to return to work full-time immediately from a financial point of view. This will supplement some of the income, and it's currently not means tested. You could be earning €1 million a year. You could be working 100 hours a week technically. But I suppose the main thing to know is that, you just need to get the form in. So the one thing is it has to be approved before you return to work. And the DSP, that's the Department of Social Protection. So you need to get your green tick, your gold star before you go back to work. And again, no restrictions on earnings or hours. So how much is it, you ask? This is again correct as of 2 days ago. Please check Citizens Information for updated information. If you were deemed as a moderate, limitation in terms of your working capacity, and you were on illness benefit, you'd get an extra €104 a week on top of your salary once you return back. And, that can make a difference. That can be over €400 a month. So cost of living crisis at the moment, everything helps. Again, it goes up to profound. So it depends on your level of restriction that they'll increase the cost. Again, they keep changing how long you'll get the payment for. As I last understood it, you will get it for as long as you had been on illness benefit or the invalidity pension. So again, criteria change. It's something to keep note of. Sick leave, am I entitled to it? This has changed since last year. Last year I said, no, you're not necessarily entitled to it. This year I'm saying you're nearly entitled. So you need to look at your contract. Typically, public sector workers usually will have it as part of their contract, and for a lot of private sector employees. But I suppose what there were a cohort, there were a group of people who weren't entitled to any sick leave. They didn't have it in their contract. And the Sick Leave Act became law in, I was going to say last month, in July of this year. And this is going to start, the employee's sick pay entitlement is going to start once there's a ministerial order. So we're nearly there. There will be some criteria, so you'll need to have been with your employer for at least 13 weeks, and you need to be certified sick by your GP. So in year one, you'll be entitled to 3 days of sick leave. They're going to do it on a graded basis. So year 2 it'll be 5, year 3 7, and year 4 you'll have up to 10 days. So moving on more so into, I suppose, the impact of some of the side effects on work. And again, this is really very much a whistle-stop tour. We're going to look at cancer-related fatigue. We run many programs on this, so I suppose this is just a few slides to give us a taster of it. And I suppose I will talk about the 4 Ps in a second. So for many of you who experience cancer-related fatigue, I suppose, you can acknowledge that it's very different from that regular fatigue. It doesn't necessarily get better with rest. And I think something that's very important to note is it's not just physical fatigue. It could be emotional fatigue, mental fatigue, or it could be cognitive fatigue. So cognition is our thinking skills. So perhaps if we've been, thinking very hard on something, we've been at the laptop doing some work or something like that, we can feel very, I suppose, a bit slower in our processing or our thinking skills. So I'm going to touch very briefly on the 4 Ps of energy conservation, which are planning, prioritizing, pacing, posture, position. And sometimes I throw in the 5th P, which is problem solving. So how we problem solve to do a task in a different way. So with planning, I want you to first think of a traffic light. I want you to think of red, amber, and green. And if we think of a red task, I want you to think of something that's very heavy, a very energy draining task. And that could be very physically draining, could be very mentally draining, or it could be very cognitively draining. I'm sure if somebody here is attending the full day session, which is brilliant, and there's so many interesting talks, you might find at the end of the day, you're a bit cognitively drained because there's a huge amount of information being thrown at you. So let's think of red as those really heavy tasks. It might be presenting, managing tills in a really busy shop, it might be attending one of those interactive training courses where you don't just have to listen, you have to contribute. If we think on the other side of green, so more lower energy tasks, so maybe it might be checking your emails or having a cup of tea or coffee with a colleague that you're very comfortable with. And then your in between is your amber, so your medium level tasks. So maybe that's commuting, writing a short report, something like that. And what's red for somebody might be amber for another person. So it's very individual. So I just want you to think of that for the minute, because we're going to put that into practice shortly. So there are traffic lights. So I want you to think in terms of our planning. It would make sense in a way, wouldn't it, that we're not going to do just red and amber tasks in a row. We need to break it up a little bit to give ourselves a physical or a mental break. So you can see here on the right hand side, we have an agenda there, and this person has broken up their tasks a little bit. They're thinking of it. And I suppose when we're trying to get used to this system, we might have to write down the list and try and jumble it a bit more, but it can get a little bit more automatic over time. So what we're trying to do is to have a look at our day. And again, with my outpatients, I would certainly look at fatigue diaries, and we'd pinpoint where people, how people might change their tasks. But if you're going to have a really heavy day, for example, so it's going to be a real red day, you might plan to do very little the next day, or you might plan to do, very little the day before, so you're not too tired for that, upcoming red day. An example is maybe a wedding. Now I know we're not talking about work in this example, but weddings can be physically and psychologically quite draining, although wonderful. And I suppose it's really looking after ourselves that we might have a bit more of a green day before, or we're not going to do too much on the day after. So it's just having that awareness to be mixing up our greens, ambers and reds. And again, not just doing physical tasks as well in a row, but you might break it up if you're able to, depending on your job role. You might switch between cognitive and physical tasks. Again, everyone is very different and everyone's job role is very different. Going on to prioritizing and pacing. So we've planned out our week or our day. So now I want us to prioritize. Do I actually need to do this today? Can it be done tomorrow? So for me, sitting down at my desk, well, I absolutely needed to do this presentation today. It was, it was timetabled. So I can't, this is a priority one. But something else that I might need to do later on in the week, I can do on Monday. That's fine. We typically try and begin with our most important task first when we're feeling a bit more bright and alert and we've had our caffeine. But again, do I have to do this? Is this something that I can delegate? We'll then look at pacing. So we want to pace ourselves, as frustrating as that might be for people who are doers. And that's around looking at adding in rest breaks between activities. So adding in a bit of a green rest break between those ambers and reds. Again, not trying to push or not trying to push through the fatigue, that we're not pushing ourselves too much. And what I'll always say is with cancer-related fatigue, it typically does get better over time, as frustration as it is that it's quite slow very often, but it's definitely something that can be managed. The other thing is breaking up larger tasks into smaller segments. So an example might be, I need to write a report. It's going to be 1,000 words and I'm going to sit down at my desk and I'm going to write 100 words and that's it. And then I'll have started it. I'll have a sense of accomplishment and I'll come back to it later. I'll go and do something else. So it's really about grading ourselves. Posture and position. We will be talking about ergonomics briefly, but you will save around 25% of energy if you complete a task when you're sitting down. Our tummy muscles are holding our bodies up. We don't even think about it, but they're constantly at work. So that's why a chair with a back is helpful, because you're supporting those tummy muscles. If we have a good posture, it's not, I suppose, if I'm leaning to the side, for example, my tummy muscles are having to work more. So having that good posture, having our feet firmly on the floor, is giving our body the best chance to manage itself. We will be talking about ergonomics shortly, but I had a lady, for example, who she's about to go back to work, and she was telling me she was cleaning out her garage. And she would typically sort out the boxes there and then in the garage, and she'd be bending and twisting and lifting. But once we had our session on fatigue, she said, well, actually, do you know what? I'm going to bring the box into my living room. And she sat down and she did it from there. And she said that actually, she'd normally feel wiped after doing that type of task, but because she was doing it and sitting down, she was able to save a little bit more energy for things that she actually wanted to do. The other thing I'll always say is mental fatigue. So when you're resting, are you really resting? So, if you're going to have a sit down, or do you know what, I need just to have a lie down to rest. I want you to think about, yes, you might be physically resting, but is your brain resting? Sometimes we will go through things like box breathing. So some of the breathing exercises, maybe a meditation app. Some people might have tried Headspace or Calm. Another app I think is quite popular is the Head Plan, I think, from an Irish company. And then, there's a few different strategies, guided imagery. So I suppose what I'm just trying to emphasize is, yes, there's physical fatigue, but also be mindful about are you mentally resting as well? Sometimes what I will suggest to people is, if you're in a noisy office, for example, in your job role, sometimes those noise cancelling headphones can be quite useful as well. So you're not processing too much information, but we'll talk about cognition now in a second. Just onto that phased return to work, I always say there's 3 principles. These are, not set in stone anywhere. It's just what I've come up with. But number 1, we'll talk about a review date, not a decision date. We'll talk about the staircase approach and working non-consecutive days. So What I would say is, and we saw in that report from the Irish Cancer Society, that a phased return was the #1 thing that people were finding helped them return to work. With the phased return, I would often say avoid setting a goalpost. So, for example, instead of saying to your employer, I'm going to be back on the 1st of December, you could say that actually I have a medical cert until the 1st of December. Closer to that time, I'm going to be in touch to review the situation with you following a discussion with my medical team. So you're automatically not putting that pressure on yourself that you have to go back to work on the 1st of December. It's just giving you a little bit more flexibility. The staircase approach. So with a phased return, we always think of, okay, I'm going to increase my hours up and up and up. But I suppose that it doesn't have to be a consistent increase in hours or days. So what I want you to think about is, if you go back to work for 1 day a week, for example, are you able to sustain that? So if you feel that over a week or 2 or 3, typically do more than a week, if it's sustainable, then I would, suggest gently increasing if you're financially in a position that you could do that. Again, you don't have to increase by a day. It could be a half day. A lot of people will say to me, okay, I've agreed that I'm going to go back to work for 2 days, and then every week I'm going to increase it by a day. But you've already set that as a contract with your employer. So what I would say, again, it's the review date. You could say, look, I'm going to go back to work for 2 days a week. After 3 weeks, I'll sit down and I'll review it with the situation with you. And I suppose staircases go up, but they also go down. So it's just to know that it's okay if you find that once you're assessing that, if you need to reduce your hours for some time. And finally, this is our traffic light system again. Consider working non-consecutive days. You can see here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. First person is working Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's 3 very heavy red days. So actually consider how you might stagger that. So for example, the second person here is working on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, just initially anyway, to manage things like fatigue. A little bit of communication. I suppose it's really recommended, and in all of the research we've done so far, that there's some level of communication between yourself and your employer while you're out. And really, it's around setting expectations as well. So if you have an employer that I suppose is maybe communicating a little bit too much, you could agree on your levels of contact. So for example, I'll be in touch in 1 month's time or 2 months, whatever it is. If we find that we're not communicating with our employer or colleagues, I think over time, anxiety can increase a little bit. So it's just being mindful of that as well. I would always, before you go back to work, I would set a meeting, a return to work meeting, set an agenda, send them an email list of what you want to discuss so there's no surprises. Some people will use leaflets to supplement their discussion. And once you've had the meeting, I would always write a brief meeting summary after and send it to them by email and in writing, so that you're making very clear in black and white what you agreed on. For example, reusable accommodations. I'm conscious of time, so we'll fly through this, but in terms of the cognitive changes in the workplace, brain fog is very common. We know that. So some strategies in terms of remembering our colleagues' names. The online meetings are helpful in that we can ask attendees to pop their names on the screen. Repetition is a strategy we would use to help with our recall. So, hi, I'm Naomi. You might say, oh, Naomi, it's nice to meet you. So you're verbally saying it. I love association personally. So I would say to people I meet on the ward, I might say, I'm Naomi, I'm the OT. Just think of Naomi Campbell. And typically they will, or Naomi Campbell in green trousers, that's our uniform. So typically they'd say, oh, it's Naomi Campbell when I come in. So they remember through association. Also ask a colleague or the person themselves. Our recall, to remember what to do, notebooks, calendars, diaries, the alarms either on the phone or through your email are very helpful. I was writing minutes for an AGM recently. I asked, could I record the AGM, because I knew it was just too much information for me to remember, and consistency where possible. Again, if we think of work and reducing background noise, if we think of our brain like a filter and we're trying to process all this information, if I'm trying to concentrate on the screen, but then somebody's talking to my left and my right, that's extra information that's going into this filter and it's blocking it. So I would very often recommend earplugs, a quieter workspace, or noise cancelling headphones. And again, mental fatigue. Again, breaking it up. If you've been concentrating on something for a lot, take a break. We're nearly there. So this is a study that was completed, I think, by Microsoft, and they looked at 4 30-minute online meetings back to back with no break. And you can see here in the brain images at the top that actually the brain was getting really overloaded. They also looked at a group of people with the same amount of meetings, but this time they put 10 minutes meditation in between each, so really switching off mentally. And you can see that the brain was functioning much better when we had that break. Ergonomics, again, we've touched on it briefly, but that you're in that 90-90-90 position. So your feet are flat on the floor, your bum is just at the very inside of your chair. And sometimes armrests can be helpful, particularly if people have maybe lymphedema or something like that, just so you're supporting your arms. Again, making sure your screen is at eye level too. Keeping everything in reach, so it makes sense that if we are, reaching for something when we're standing, it is better to have items that we regularly grab between our shoulder level and our hip level, because we're not reaching and we're not bending. Similarly, if we're sitting down, anything that is within my reach should be within area D, and anything that I'm reaching over for in area E should be less used. So it's just being clever about our space. And finally, assessing readiness to return to work. With my outpatients and James's, if we're doing return to work, very often I will do a job simulation. So we will plan a fake work day. We'll have a talk about your job role. We'll reflect on some type of tasks you do in your typical day. And we will make up a fake work day, and sometimes I will even add the commute to the day. So I'll make them drive for the length of time they would typically drive for, or hop in the bus or something like that. Although I've been veering away from getting them to drive in the car with the cost of fuel recently. And it's really about grading ourselves. So we'll assess it after, and we'll say, okay, how did you feel after half a day of work? Or what if we try and do a full day? We might try and do it a week or two later, try and do 2 days in a row, or break up the 2 days. So again, it's very individual for people. So my final slide, I challenge you to set a goal. I want you, if you have not returned to work at this stage, or you're, it's okay if you don't know what you're doing, or you're mulling over what you want to do. I challenge you to choose one thing to do this week that might help. So for example, if you've been avoiding talking to your employer or colleagues, send them an email or text one colleague. You might request the partial capacity benefit form. You might send your employer a meeting agenda, or you might look in to book or schedule in a work day to assess your readiness. Maybe try one of the strategies we talked about for fatigue, or maybe make a list of things that you might think might help in terms of reasonable accommodations. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions, and hopefully I'll be able to see something in the chat box shortly. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. There's a lot of information in that. And, there's a lot of food for thought. And I suppose, I think that one of the big things that came across, particularly in relation to returning to work, is communication. In other words, chatting to your employer. And I suppose not just kind of having a date in mind of going back to work, say 1st of October, and saying, right, have a chat, open up the lines of communication with your employer in advance, so that you're not kind of sitting there the night before on the 30th of September going, I'm really not ready for this, And I suppose writing things down, writing your ideas down, and those things that Dr. Algeo was saying, about, can I do a phased return? Can I review the situation? The staircase approach. And I think that's really important for people, because you might think, yeah, I'll go back to work full time, and you're back a week and you're going, you know what, this isn't working for me. And you go back and renegotiate, So I think it's not setting yourself up for a disappointment. I think that staircase is a great way to visualize it and kind of say, you know, yes, I might go up 3 steps, but you know what, I might actually come back down a step. You know what I mean? I think that's really, really important to remember that. And I think strategies, think having little strategies for things, particularly in relation to, you know, brain fog and kind of ideas of, you know, how am I going to manage this? Writing things down, having diaries, spacing things out over the course of the day. Really some brilliant stuff there. I mean, and, you know, that we could all use. You know, definitely. There's a couple of questions here in the chat box. I'm just going to see if I can find it there. Scroll back up to it. I know. Yeah, so somebody has asked the question, if a company already has a remote working policy, is it considered reasonable to ask for a remote working accommodation outside of the policy in place? So what they're saying is that they're only allowed in the policy to work 2 days from home. Can I reasonably ask to work 4 days at home?
I would argue yes, you can. Yeah, absolutely. If your job role enables you, it sounds like if there is a remote working anyway, that there should be a possibility. So yes, I would definitely argue that you absolutely can. I mean, there are some job roles, for example, where they offer some flexibility in terms of hours, but there's no reason why you couldn't say, well, actually, for a reasonable accommodation, could I work that little bit later in the day so I don't have to manage that horrible commute, for example, that I go in a little bit later than outside of the policy. So yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Yeah, very good. I suppose there's a few thank yous there as well, and the fatigue tips are very welcome, and the traffic light system for daily tasks. I mean, that's, you know, it's such a simple thing, the traffic light system, but it makes sense. You know, it really does.
Yeah.
Somebody has asked a question there about how long does it take to get the partial capacity benefit approved?
Okay, so I am going to speak from my experience in the last maybe month or so doing applications, well, supporting applications for people. In my experience, from the moment you get the form in, you will typically get an acknowledgement letter within a few days to say that they've received it. In my experience, it has taken between 3, 4, maybe 5 weeks to get the approval. They will warn you and say that it will be at least 6 weeks, but they're doing that really to cover themselves. But in my experience, it is much quicker. There was a huge backlog a year or two ago, but thankfully they've got on top of that.
And I think, you know, that partial capacity benefit is really useful for people who are under financial pressure, you know, so they're coming near the end of sick pay or they're running out of their savings or whatever. And this way is a kind of a win-win where you can go back to work on a part-time basis and still have this partial capacity benefit. So, you know, it is really useful for people. There's another question there about how far can a role adjustment go in terms of work requirements?
In terms of an accommodation, is it? In terms of change?
I'm assuming so. Yeah.
There is there's no definition on that. What I would always say is, again, it's that review date, not a goalpost date. So you know, don't put yourself under pressure by saying, can I change my job description and do these duties for 3 months? You know, ask for that accommodation in terms of what you want to change about your role, and ask to review it in X amount of time. Again, it'll come up in a conversation with your employer perhaps at some stage to say, you know, do we need to look at changing your contract or your job description permanently? But don't put yourself under that pressure initially. I've had people who say, oh, you know, I'm going to completely change my job description and change my contract immediately. Give yourself a chance, you know, try with the reasonable accommodations, give yourself some time. Time is a wonderful thing. So, you know, again, just I wouldn't make any rash decisions. There's no set time in terms of how long an accommodation has to last for.
And I think one of the things that's coming across in all of this is that planning is a huge part of this, you know, especially around fatigue and things like that, planning your day and so on. And the same way with planning when you're going back to work. So it's writing things down. So in advance of you talking to your employer, it's writing things down, because as well as you possibly having brain fog, which, you know, a lot of us can have on the best day of the week, regardless of treatment, you know, I mean, you know, writing things down so that when you're in with your employer, that you haven't left and gone, oh gosh, I should have asked him this, you know what I mean? So again, planning, writing down everything. Some things may come up in the natural flow of conversation, but I think it's very useful to write things down and have kind of all your thoughts on paper when you go in to have a chat, and also have your research done as well. Just to say as well, there's this session has been recorded, so you will get an email afterwards with a recording of this. So if some of you have taken notes and you haven't been able to take them fast enough like me, you know, there is a recording, so you can go back and look at it again. So just for anybody who's kind of wondering. And the other thing is, if you have any questions, I've put the number for the support line there up at the very top of the chat. So if you come up with any questions or anything after this session, feel free to ring the support line on Monday. Their number is there. They're open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. And also we have daffodil centres around the country. We have one in Letterkenny, Galway, Limerick, the Bonds in Cork, University Hospital Cork, Waterford, St Vincent's, Tala, James's, the Hermitage, Beaumont and the Mater. So and actually Dr Algeo works in St James's as well. So there is a daffodil centre there, and you know, maybe somebody might be able to send a question to you via email, via the nurse in the Daffodil Centre as well. So, you know, if anybody thinks of anything. I just see somebody's put up a comment there that their employer did a wellness plan on their return, actually, which sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about wellness plans that maybe you could tell people about?
They sound like a wonderful employer. It depends. Every employer has different structures or facilities available. So, for example, some of our larger companies might have very good occupational health systems in place. Now, occupational health is different from occupational therapy. I'm an OT, an occupational therapist, but if I would encourage you to look and see, if you have an occupational health, what resources are available. For example, some will have the employee assistance program, which are free counselling sessions, for example. Obviously link in with your cancer support centres as well. Some companies will have buddy systems, like a peer support system, where they will offer to link another colleague who's had, for example, a previous cancer diagnosis, to guide you through your return to work. It's rare, but it's becoming, I suppose, more commonplace, thankfully. So there are systems in place. HSE employees, there is a new, there will be a new support system, peer system as well, that's currently being worked on too. There's, I know the buddies or the peer support people are getting trained at the moment. So there's lots of things happening. It's just not, you know, nationwide just yet.
Yeah, that's it. I think I've got all the questions that are in the chat box there. I've learned an awful lot from that today, you know, that talk. So there's been some really useful information in it. Thank you so much, Naomi. It's been really brilliant, and, you know, your expertise, and for passing them on to all of us. So thank you again. And just a reminder to anyone, if you want to contact the support line, if you have any questions after the weekend. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.